The chains rattled in the darkness as Jameson Keller pressed his body flat against the muddy ground, inching forward on his elbows while the patrol passed 20 feet to his left, their torches casting dancing shadows across the rows of iron cages that filled the slave camp. He had walked 3 days without stopping, driven by a rumor heard in a tavern 2 towns back, a rumor that the Crimson Fang mercenaries had captured an entire orc settlement and were holding the survivors here before selling them to the mining operations in the western mountains. He had no plan beyond getting inside, no weapons except a rusted knife tucked in his boot, and no reason to be here except the weight of guilt that had followed him for the past 2 years since he had served in the border wars and learned too late what kind of orders he had been following. The patrol moved past, their voices fading into the night, and Jameson crawled forward again, his fingers sinking into the cold mud as he made his way between the rows of cages. The smell hit him hard: unwashed bodies, fear, and the metallic tang of blood. Most of the prisoners were sleeping or too exhausted to notice him, but a few sets of eyes tracked his movement in the darkness. Human eyes, orc eyes, even a pair of elven eyes in one cage, all of them reflecting the dim moonlight with the same hollow hopelessness. He moved methodically, checking each cage as he passed, though he did not know what he was looking for. Perhaps someone young and strong enough to make the journey if he could somehow get them out. Perhaps someone who looked like they still had fight left in them. The reality of his situation pressed down on him. With each cage he passed, he could maybe pick one lock if he was lucky. Maybe get one person out. And even then, their chances of making it past the walls and the guards were nearly non-existent. But he kept crawling because stopping meant admitting he had come here to die for nothing, and he was not ready to face that truth yet. The last row of cages sat furthest from the guard stations, partially hidden by a collapsed wooden structure that might have once been a barn. The cages here were smaller, more cramped, and the prisoners inside them looked worse than the others. Jameson dragged himself to the first cage and peered inside, seeing a human man who stared back at him with eyes that did not register hope or fear, just dull acceptance. The next cage held 2 orc children huddled together, their small tusks barely visible in their gaunt faces. The sight made his stomach turn, and he forced himself to keep moving. The last cage sat at the very end of the row, partially obscured by the shadow of the collapsed barn. Jameson almost missed it in the darkness, but something made him pause. He crawled closer and saw her, an orc woman sitting with her back against the bars, her legs drawn up to her chest, her green skin mottled with bruises and cuts. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves past her shoulders. Her tusks were small and delicate, curving slightly upward from her lower jaw, and her pointed ears twitched slightly as he approached. "I prayed for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jameson froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not expected anyone to speak, let alone with such calm certainty. He crawled closer until he was pressed against the bars of her cage, studying her face in the moonlight. Her eyes were amber, bright despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her body, and they fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "What did you say?" he whispered back. "I prayed for you," she repeated, shifting slightly so she could look at him more directly. "Every night for the past week, I prayed to the old gods and the new, to any power that might be listening. I prayed for someone brave enough or foolish enough to come. I prayed for a chance, and here you are." Jameson swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "I am just one man. I do not even know if I can get you out of here." "But you came," she said, and something like a smile touched her lips despite the circumstances. "That is more than anyone else has done. What is your name?" Jameson, he said automatically. Jameson Keller. I am Roksha, she said. And I think you and I are going to need each other if either of us wants to see morning. He wanted to tell her that she was putting too much faith in him, that he had no real plan, that he was probably going to get them both killed. But before he could speak, the sound of shouting erupted from the far end of the camp. Torches flared to life, and the alarm bell began to clang with harsh urgency. They found where you came in, Roksha said calmly, though her hands gripped the bars of her cage until her knuckles went pale. You have maybe 2 minutes before they start searching systematically. Can you pick a lock? Jameson fumbled for the lockpick he had fashioned from a bent nail, his hands shaking as he inserted it into the heavy padlock securing her cage. He had practiced on locks back home, had spent hours teaching himself the skill because some part of him had known he would eventually come to a place like this. But his fingers felt clumsy now, the urgency making him rush when he needed to be patient. Breathe, Roksha said softly. You did not come this far to fail because you panicked. Breathe and feel the mechanism. Her voice had a strange effect on him, cutting through the noise and chaos to create a small pocket of calm. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and tried again. This time he felt the pins shifting inside the lock, felt the subtle resistance and give of the mechanism. He worked carefully, listening to the sound of boots running past them toward the breach in the fence. And after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the lock clicked open. Roksha moved immediately, pushing the cage door open and crawling out with practiced silence despite the clear pain in her movements. Up close, Jameson could see that her left leg was badly bruised, maybe even broken, but she did not make a sound as she tested her weight on it. Can you run? He whispered. I will crawl if I have to, she said, but we are not going through the fence. Too many guards converging there now. There is a drainage ditch on the east side flows under the wall. I watched them dump refuse through it. It will be tight and it will be foul, but it leads outside. Jameson did not question how she had managed to observe so much from inside a cage. He simply nodded and let her take the lead, following as she moved between the rows of cages with surprising speed despite her injury. The other prisoners watched them pass, some with hope in their eyes, some with resignation, but none of them called out or gave them away. There was an unspoken understanding in places like this: you took your chances when they came, and you did not damn someone else for taking theirs. The drainage ditch was exactly where Roksha said it would be, a narrow opening in the stone foundation of the wall that reeked of rot and waste. Jameson's stomach heaved as he approached it, but Roksha was already lowering herself into the opening, her face set in determined lines. I will go first, she said. If I get stuck, you can still go back. Not a chance, Jameson said. We both make it or neither of us does. She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that he could not quite read in the darkness. Then she nodded and slipped into the ditch, disappearing from view. Jameson counted to 3 and followed, dropping into a nightmare of cold water and things he did not want to identify. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to turn his head sideways to keep his face above the foul water as he pushed himself forward using his elbows and knees. The darkness was absolute, broken only by brief glimpses of moonlight through the grates above them where the ditch passed under the camp's interior. He could hear Roksha ahead of him, hear her labored breathing and the splash of water as she forced herself forward. The passage seemed to go on forever, his shoulders screaming from the confined space, his lungs burning from the fetid air. Just when he thought he might have to stop, might have to admit he could not make it, the passage opened up, and he tumbled out into a larger culvert where the ditch emptied into a stream outside the camp walls. Roksha pulled him out of the water, her hands surprisingly strong despite everything she had been through. They collapsed together on the muddy bank, both of them gasping for air, covered in filth but alive and outside the walls. "We have to move," Roksha said after only a few seconds of rest. "They will figure out we went this way eventually. How far away are your supplies?" "I do not have supplies," Jameson admitted, pushing himself to his feet and offering her his hand. "I came with a knife, a lockpick, and not much else." Roksha stared at him, and for the first time since he had seen her, she looked genuinely shocked. Then she started to laugh, quiet, breathless laughter that had an edge of hysteria to it. "You really are a fool. The kind of fool I prayed for, apparently. All right, then. I know this country. There is an abandoned farmstead about 5 miles east. If we can make it there before dawn, we might have a chance." 5 miles might as well have been 50 with her injured leg, but Jameson did not argue. He let her lean on him, taking as much of her weight as she would allow, and they started walking into the forest that bordered the stream. Behind them, the sounds of the camp were growing more organized, more focused. Soon, they would have tracking dogs and mounted patrols, and their chances of escape would drop to nearly nothing. They made it maybe 2 miles before Roksha's leg gave out completely. She went down hard, biting back a cry of pain, and when Jameson examined her leg in the growing pre-dawn light, he could see that it was definitely broken below the knee. The bone had not pierced the skin, but the swelling and discoloration were unmistakable. "Leave me," Roksha said through gritted teeth. "You can move faster alone, find help and maybe come back later." "Not happening," Jameson said. He looked around, assessing their situation. They were in a dense section of forest, the underbrush thick enough to provide some cover. "Can you climb?" "What? Can you climb a tree, even with one good leg?" Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Yes, but they will see us if they look up. Better than the alternative. The dogs will track our scent on the ground, but most people do not think to look up unless they have a reason. Come on." He helped her to a large oak with low, hanging branches, then essentially pushed and pulled her up into the canopy, while she bit down on a strip of leather from her ragged clothing to keep from crying out. They settled into a spot where 3 large branches met, forming a relatively stable platform about 20 feet off the ground. Jameson used his belt and some strips of cloth torn from his shirt to secure them both to the trunk, and then they waited. The patrol passed beneath them just after dawn, 6 men on horses with 3 hunting dogs straining at their leashes. The dogs caught their scent and circled the area, barking and whining, but the handlers assumed they had crossed the nearby stream and moved on after a few tense minutes. Jameson and Roksha stayed frozen in place for another hour after the patrol disappeared, neither of them willing to risk moving too soon. "Why did you come?" Roksha asked finally, her voice barely audible even though they were pressed close together in the tree. "You are human. Why risk your life for orc slaves?" Jameson was quiet for a long time, watching the morning light filter through the leaves. "I fought in the border wars 2 years ago. I thought I was defending settlements from raiders. I thought I was doing something noble. Then I found out what we were really doing, burning orc villages that had nothing to do with the raids, taking prisoners who were sold as slaves, killing anyone who resisted, including children and elders. I tried to refuse orders and got court-martialed. By the time I got out of military prison, the war was over, but it did not matter because I already knew the truth. We were the raiders. We were the monsters, and I have been trying to figure out how to live with that ever since." Roksha was quiet, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "So this is penance. Maybe, or maybe it is just trying to be the person I thought I was before I learned otherwise. I do not know. Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said. Penance implies you still think you were a monster who needs to atone, but you refused orders. You went to prison rather than follow them. That is not a monster, Jameson Keller. That is a man who found his conscience before it was too late. He felt something loosen in his chest at her words, some knot of guilt that had been pulled so tight for so long that he had forgotten it was there. Your leg needs proper treatment. Once it gets dark, I will carry you to that farmstead you mentioned. We can rest there and figure out our next move. You cannot carry me 5 miles, not in one trip. Watch me. They waited through the long day, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Roksha told him about her life before the raid. She had been a healer in her clan, learning the old ways from her grandmother. She described the herbs and roots she used, the rituals and practices that combined practical medicine with spiritual tradition. Jameson found himself genuinely interested, asking questions, learning about a culture he had been taught to fear and hate. When night fell, he made good on his promise. He fashioned a rough carrier from branches and his jacket, allowing him to bear her weight on his back while keeping his hands free for balance. The journey was brutal. He fell twice, scraped his knees raw, and pulled something in his shoulder. But he kept going, driven by sheer stubborn determination, until finally they saw the dark shape of buildings through the trees. The farmstead was more intact than he had hoped. The main house had a collapsed roof, but the barn was still standing, and more importantly, it had a loft with old hay that provided both cushioning and insulation. Jameson got Roksha settled in the loft, then spent the next hour gathering water from a nearby well and searching the abandoned buildings for anything useful. He found some rusted tools, a few pieces of cloth that might have once been curtains, and in the root cellar beneath the collapsed house, several jars of preserved vegetables that were probably unsafe to eat, but he was too hungry to care. When he climbed back up to the loft, Roksha had arranged the hay into a more comfortable nest and was examining her injured leg with a healer's critical eye. "I need to set this properly before it starts healing crooked," she said. "Have you ever set a broken bone before?" "No," Jameson admitted. "But I am willing to learn if you talk me through it." She did, her voice calm and instructional even as she prepared herself for what would clearly be an agonizing process. She had him find 2 straight pieces of wood for splints, then tear the curtain cloth into strips for binding. When everything was ready, she lay back in the hay, bit down on another strip of leather, and nodded for him to begin. Jameson had never done anything harder than manipulating her broken leg into proper alignment, while she shook with suppressed pain. His hands felt huge and clumsy, terrified of making things worse. But he followed her instructions exactly and eventually got the bone back into place and the splint secured. When it was done, Roksha spat out the leather and lay gasping, her skin pale beneath its green tone, sweat beading on her forehead. "You did well," she managed to say. "Thank you." "Rest now," Jameson said, using one of the cleaner pieces of cloth to wipe the sweat from her face. "I will keep watch. We should both rest," she said. "Anyone looking for us will check here eventually, but not tonight. They will search the forest more thoroughly first. We have a little time." She was right, and Jameson was too exhausted to argue. He lay down beside her in the hay, maintaining a respectful distance, but Roksha shifted closer until her back was against his chest. "Warmer this way," she said simply. "And safer if one of us has a nightmare, the other will wake them before they make noise." Practical reasoning. But Jameson could not help noticing how perfectly she fit against him, or how, despite everything they had been through, there was something comforting about her presence. He let himself relax for the first time in days and drifted into uneasy sleep. The next few days established a pattern. Jameson ventured out at night to scavenge supplies and check for patrols, while Roksha rested and slowly recovered her strength. He brought her herbs he found growing wild, and she directed him in making poultices and teas that helped with her pain and inflammation. Slowly, carefully, they began to feel almost safe in their hidden refuge. It was during these quiet hours that they really began to know each other. Roksha had a sharp wit that surprised him, often making observations about his habits that were simultaneously accurate and amusing. She teased him about his tendency to check the perimeter exactly every 2 hours, calling it his soldier's dance. He retaliated by pointing out how she organized every item in the loft by both type and potential use, calling her a healer's hoarder. "Everything has a purpose if you look at it correctly," she protested, gesturing at the collection of seemingly random objects she had asked him to bring back. "These rusted nails can be boiled down for iron supplements if I get too anemic. That moldy leather could provide penicillin in the right conditions. You just lack imagination." "I lack imagination. I am the one who thought to check if the well had fish in it. And I am the one who told you those fish were poisonous before you ate them. How did you even know that from just a description? I am a healer, Jameson. I know poisons almost as well as I know cures. That fish you described, red fins with yellow spots. We call them devil swimmers. One bite would have had you vomiting for 3 days if it did not kill you outright." He could not help but laugh, shaking his head. "I suppose I should stop complaining about you rejecting half of what I bring back then." "Most of what you bring back is perfectly fine," she said, her tone softening. "You are a good scavenger for someone who grew up in towns, better than I expected." "Where did you grow up?" he asked, settling back against a support beam. "You mentioned your grandmother taught you healing, but you never said where." Roksha was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the hay. "The Northern Territories, about 60 miles from here. Our clan had a settlement in the foothills, good water, good hunting, far enough from human territories that we thought we were safe. My grandmother was the clan's chief healer, and I was her apprentice from the time I could walk. She said I had the gift, the ability to sense what was wrong with a body just by touching it. I do not know if it was magic or just good intuition, but she believed in it completely." "What happened to your clan?" Jameson asked gently. "The same thing that happened to 100 other orc settlements during your border wars. Soldiers came in the night claiming we were harboring raiders. We were not. We had a peace agreement with the nearby human villages, traded with them regularly. But someone wanted our land or wanted to fill their slave quotas, and the truth did not matter. Most of the warriors died defending the settlement. The rest of us were taken." "I am sorry," Jameson said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I know you are," Roksha said, looking at him with those amber eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "I can tell the difference between empty words and genuine remorse. You carry it with you like a physical weight. I can see it in how you move, how you flinch every time I mention the wars. But Jameson, you did not lead the raid on my settlement. You did not take me prisoner. You are not responsible for everything every human has ever done to every orc. Then why does it feel like I am?" "Because you have a conscience," she said simply. "Because you are a good man trying to exist in a world that rewarded you for being something else. That is a hard place to be." They fell into comfortable silence after that, and Jameson found himself watching the way the moonlight through the barn's gaps illuminated her face. She was beautiful, he could admit that now, could acknowledge what he had been trying not to notice since the moment he first saw her in that cage. But more than that, she was strong and clever and kind, despite every reason she had not to be. She could have left him behind 6 times by now, could have conserved her energy and let him take all the risks. Instead, she stayed, helped, shared her knowledge, and somehow made him feel less alone than he had felt in years. "What are you thinking about?" Roksha asked, catching him staring. "That I am glad I found your cage," he said honestly. "That I am glad you prayed for someone to come." She smiled, and there was something in that smile that made his heart beat faster. "So am I." On the 5th day, Jameson returned from a scouting trip with troubling news. "There is a patrol camped about 2 miles south. 10 men, well armed, and they are not moving on. I think they have established it as a search base." Roksha absorbed this information calmly, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. "My leg is healing faster than expected. I can walk short distances with a crutch. We should move on soon before they expand their search radius." "Move where?" "We are still at least a week from the border, and that is if you were at full health. In your condition, trying to make that journey could kill you." "Staying here will definitely get us caught," she countered. "At least moving gives us a chance." "There might be another option," Jameson said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. "About 10 miles west of here, there is a small village called Millbrook. I passed through it on my way to the slave camp. It is mostly farmers and craftspeople, the kind of place where no one pays much attention to travelers passing through. If we could make it there, we could rest properly, buy supplies, maybe even find a wagon heading toward the border that we could hire on with." "You want to walk into a human village with an orc? They would turn us in immediately." "Not if they think you are human too. Your tusks are small, and if we cover your ears with a head wrap and use makeup to lighten your skin tone, you could pass, especially if no one is looking too closely." Roksha stared at him like he had grown a second head. "This is the worst plan I have ever heard. Do you have a better one?" She was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "No, which is the only reason I am even considering this madness." "But Jameson, if this goes wrong, if someone recognizes what I am, they will not just capture us. They will kill us both, probably in the town square as an example. Then we will have to make sure no one recognizes what you are," he said with more confidence than he felt. "I have been thinking about this. There was rouge and powder in one of the houses, old but still usable. We can practice the disguise here, make sure it is convincing before we risk going anywhere public. And I will coach you on human mannerisms, speech patterns, things that might give you away." "You realize this is insane." "Completely," he agreed. "But we are already fugitives hiding in an abandoned barn and eating questionable preserves. Insane seems to be our baseline now." Despite herself, Roksha laughed, and the sound filled the dark barn with unexpected warmth. "All right, Jameson Keller, we will try your insane plan. But if I end up dead because I let a human talk me into pretending to be human, I am going to haunt you." "I would expect nothing less." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Jameson retrieved the cosmetics he had found, along with several headscarves and a dress that was worn but serviceable. The process of transforming Roksha's appearance was painstaking. They had to find the right mixture of powder and rouge to lighten her green skin to something that could pass for a deep tan. Had to practice wrapping the scarves in ways that looked natural while completely concealing her pointed ears. The tusks were the easiest part. Ironically, when she kept her mouth mostly closed and spoke carefully, they were barely noticeable. "How do I look?" she asked after their final trial run, standing before him in the dress with her disguise complete. "Like a farm woman with a deep tan," Jameson said honestly. "Not like an orc at all, but we need to work on how you stand. You have a warrior's posture, back straight, shoulders back, ready for anything. Human women in rural areas tend to curve their shoulders more, make themselves smaller. It is not fair, but it is what people will expect to see." Roksha practiced adjusting her posture, and Jameson coached her through other small details: how to walk with a slight sway instead of a march, how to keep her eyes lowered in the presence of men, all the subtle performances that human women had to master in this world. She hated every minute of it, and he did not blame her, but she was a quick study and soon could switch between her natural bearing and the disguise almost instantly. "What story do we tell?" she asked. "If anyone asks who we are and where we are going, we are siblings," Jameson decided. "Brother and sister traveling to stay with relatives after our farm failed. It explains why we are traveling together but do not act like a married couple, and why we are poor and looking for work. Your name is Rosanna, close enough to your real name that you will respond naturally, but human enough not to raise questions." "Rosanna," she repeated, testing the name. "All right, I can be Rosanna. And you are my protective older brother who does all the talking while I play the shy, demure woman." "Exactly. The less you have to speak, the less chance of you saying something that gives us away." They set out the next morning, moving slowly to accommodate Roksha's healing leg. Jameson had fashioned her a proper crutch from a sturdy branch, and with it she could manage a decent pace. They traveled by day for the first time since the escape, and the sunlight felt almost surreal after so many nights of sneaking through darkness. The countryside was beautiful in a way Jameson had almost forgotten: rolling hills dotted with small farms, forests thick with spring growth, streams clear enough to see the stones at the bottom. Roksha seemed equally affected by the scenery, often pausing to look at birds or wildflowers with an expression of wonder that reminded him how long she had been caged before he found her. "The world is still here," she said once, more to herself than to him. "I kept forgetting that while I was locked up, that there was still a world outside the cage, still beauty and growing things. It felt like the cage was everything, like nothing existed beyond it." "It is still here," Jameson confirmed, "and you are in it again. You are free." "We are not free until we cross the border," she corrected, but she was smiling as she said it. "But this is closer than I have been in months. I will take it." They reached Millbrook late in the afternoon of the second day. The village was exactly as Jameson remembered: a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a central square, with farms spreading out in all directions. There was an inn that doubled as a tavern, a general store, a blacksmith, and a small church. Nothing fancy, nothing memorable, exactly the kind of place where two travelers passing through would barely warrant a second glance. "Ready?" Jameson asked as they paused at the edge of town. Roksha took a deep breath, adjusted her head scarf, and let her shoulders curve into the posture they had practiced. When she looked up at him, she was Rosanna, a tired farm woman leaning on her brother for support. "Ready." They walked into Millbrook together, and Jameson felt every eye in the village tracking them. It was normal for strangers to attract attention in a small town, he reminded himself. It did not mean anyone suspected anything. He kept his expression neutral and pleasant, nodding greetings to the few people they passed on their way to the inn. The innkeeper was a stout woman named Martha who looked them over with the practiced eye of someone who had sized up thousands of travelers. "Looking for a room?" she asked. "If you have one available," Jameson said. "My sister and I are traveling to stay with relatives in Thornwood. We have coined for a few nights' lodging and meals." Martha named a price that was higher than it should have been, but not outrageous enough to argue over. Jameson counted out the coins money he had taken from a guard's pocket during the escape, and Martha handed him a key. "Top of the stairs, second door on the left. Meals are included: breakfast at dawn, dinner at dusk. Your sister looks poorly. Is she sick?" "Injured," Jameson said. "Broke her leg falling from a ladder. It is healing, but she needs rest." "Well, see that you keep her in the room if she is contagious with anything. I cannot afford to have sickness spreading through my establishment. It is just a broken leg, not a plague, Jameson assured her. Martha grunted acceptance and waved them toward the stairs. The room was small but clean, with a single bed, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the main square. As soon as the door closed behind them, Roksha collapsed into the room's only chair, her whole body shaking. "That was the most terrifying thing I have ever done," she said, "and I have fought wolves with nothing but a spear." "You did perfectly," Jameson said, checking the window to make sure no one was watching. "She did not suspect a thing. How can you tell? What if she is downstairs right now reporting us to the authorities? If she suspected anything, she would not have rented us the room. She would have made an excuse and sent us away, then reported us. The fact that we are here means we passed the first test." Roksha nodded, though she still looked uncertain. "How long do we stay?" "2 days to rest and gather supplies, then we move on before anyone has time to look at us too closely. I will go to the general store tomorrow and buy what we need for the journey to the border. You stay here and recover your strength. The less you are seen in public, the better." "I hate hiding," she said softly. "I hate pretending to be something I am not, hate covering my ears and painting my skin and making myself small and quiet. This is what humans want us to be, is it not? Invisible. Or at least, invisible as ourselves." Jameson knelt in front of her chair so he could look her in the eyes. "This is temporary. Once we cross the border, once we reach the free territories, you can be exactly who you are with no apologies and no disguises. I promise you that. Just a little longer." "You keep making me promises," she said, reaching out to touch his face with surprising gentleness. "I hope you can keep them." "I will," he said, "or die trying." That night, they shared the bed for the first time since the barn, and the intimacy of it felt different here, in a real room with clean sheets and the sounds of the village settling down around them. Jameson lay on his back staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of Roksha beside him, of the warmth of her body and the sound of her breathing. "Jameson," she said quietly in the darkness. "Yes. When you said you were glad you found my cage, did you mean it? Or were you just being kind?" He rolled onto his side to face her, though he could barely make out her features in the gloom. "I meant it. Every word. Finding you, helping you, these past days with you, it is the first time since the war that I have felt like my life had a purpose beyond just existing. You make me want to be the man I thought I was before everything went wrong." "You are that man," she said firmly. "You have always been that man. You just lost sight of it for a while." She shifted closer, and suddenly they were face to face on the pillow, sharing breath. Jameson felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the pull of something between them that had been building since that first night in the slave camp. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a demand. Roksha went still for a heartbeat, then kissed him back, her hand coming up to cup the back of his neck. It was sweet and desperate at the same time, two people who had been alone too long finding unexpected connection in the darkness. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Roksha let out a shaky laugh. "That was probably a terrible idea." "Probably," Jameson agreed. "Do you regret it?" "No," she said. "Do you? Not even a little bit." She kissed him again, deeper this time, and Jameson pulled her close, careful of her injured leg. They did not take it further than kissing and holding each other. The situation was too precarious, their emotions too raw, and neither wanted to rush something that felt too important to treat casually. But they fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time since his escape from military prison, Jameson slept without nightmares. The next morning he went to the general store as planned, leaving Roksha to rest in the room. The store was run by an elderly man who was more interested in gossip than sales, and Jameson had to endure 20 minutes of stories about village affairs before he could purchase the supplies they needed: dried meat, hard bread, a better water skin, a real knife to replace his rusted one, and a warm cloak for Roksha. "You and your sister staying long?" the shopkeeper asked as he wrapped the purchases. "Just another day or two," Jameson said. "Then we continue on to Thornwood." "Well, be careful on the roads. Been hearing reports of escaped prisoners in the area. Slave camp up north had a breakout about a week ago, and the patrols have been searching everywhere. They even came through here asking questions, checking travelers." Jameson kept his expression carefully neutral even as his stomach dropped. "Did they find who they were looking for?" "Not yet. 2 of them, apparently a man and an orc woman. Can you imagine? An orc and a human traveling together? What kind of man would help one of those creatures escape?" The shopkeeper shook his head in disgust. "They are offering a reward, though. 50 gold pieces for information leading to their capture. That is more money than most folks in this village will see in 5 years. "Quite a sum," Jameson managed to say. "I will keep my eyes open. Thank you for the warning." He left the store fighting the urge to run, forcing himself to walk calmly back to the inn even though every instinct was screaming at him to grab Roksha and flee. When he reached their room, he found her sitting by the window, and one look at his face told her something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked immediately. "They know we came this direction. They have patrols checking villages and travelers, and there is a bounty on us: 50 gold pieces." Roksha closed her eyes, her hands gripping the windowsill. "That is enough money to change someone's life in a place like this." "Someone will sell us out, Jameson. If not today, then tomorrow, as soon as anyone looks at me too closely and realizes what is under the disguise. We leave tonight," Jameson decided. "As soon as it is dark enough to move without being seen. We head east instead of west, throw them off the trail, then circle back toward the border once we have put some distance between us and the search parties. My leg is not ready for hard travel. Then I will carry you when you cannot walk. We do not have a choice anymore. Staying here is too dangerous." Roksha nodded, her jaw set in determined lines. "All right. We do it your way. But Jameson, if we get caught, if it comes down to one of us getting away, you run. You do not stay for me. You do not try to fight them. You run and you survive. Promise me." "I am not going to promise that. Promise me." Her voice was fierce, almost angry. "I have been a captive once already. I know what that is like, and I can survive it again if I have to. But you, they will execute you for helping me escape. They will make an example of you. I cannot have your death on my conscience, Jameson. If things go wrong, you save yourself. That is the only way I can keep moving forward right now." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that he would never abandon her, but he could see the fear and determination warring in her eyes. So he lied. "I promise." She seemed to relax slightly, though he suspected she knew he was lying. They spent the rest of the day packing their supplies and planning their route. When darkness fell, they slipped out of the inn through a back window, leaving the key on the bed and as much coin as Jameson could spare to cover the cost of the broken window latch. They made it to the edge of the village without incident, moving through back gardens and along the shadows cast by buildings. Jameson was just beginning to think they might actually pull this off when a voice called out from behind them. "You there! Stop!" They ran. Roksha's injured leg slowed her badly, and Jameson practically dragged her the last few yards into the cover of the forest. Behind them, he could hear shouting, hear the sound of people rousing from their homes to investigate the commotion. They crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at their faces, and Jameson had no idea where they were going except away. They made it perhaps half a mile before Roksha stumbled and went down hard. Jameson hauled her back to her feet, but he could see that she was favoring her bad leg badly, maybe had re-injured it in the fall. "I cannot run anymore," she gasped. "You need to go without me." "Not happening," Jameson said. He pulled her arm over his shoulders and half carried her deeper into the forest, searching desperately for somewhere to hide. The sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Dogs now. He could hear them baying. They had maybe minutes before they were overrun. Then he saw a fallen tree with a hollow underneath where the roots had pulled up a section of earth. It was barely large enough for one person, let alone two, but it was the only option they had. He shoved Roksha into the hollow, then crawled in after her, pulling branches and leaves over the opening. They lay pressed together in absolute darkness, breathing as quietly as they could manage while their hearts raced. Jameson could feel every inch of Roksha against him in the confined space, could feel her shaking with pain and fear. He found her hand in the darkness and squeezed it, offering what comfort he could. The patrol passed terrifyingly close. Jameson could see torchlight through the gaps in their camouflage, could hear the dogs snuffling and whining. For a horrible moment, he thought one of the dogs had caught their scent and was going to dig them out. But then the handler called it back, and the patrol moved on, their voices fading into the distance. They stayed in the hollow for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, neither willing to risk emerging too soon. When Jameson finally pushed aside the branches and crawled out, his entire body was cramped and aching. He helped Roksha out, then checked her leg by the light of the moon. "I think you tore the healing tissue when you fell," he said grimly. "We need to rest, let you recover." "We cannot rest," Roksha said. "They will be back at first light with more men and more dogs. We have to keep moving, put as much distance between us and them as possible. You can barely walk. Then you carry me, or leave me, but we cannot stay here." Jameson looked at her, at this woman who had been through so much and refused to give up, and felt something shift inside his chest. "I am not leaving you. But Roksha, you need to know I do not think I can get us both to the border. Not like this, not with them actively hunting us. We need help." "Help from where? Who would help a fugitive and an escaped slave?" Jameson thought back to his time in military prison, to the people he had met there. Most had been discharged or moved on, but there was one man, another deserter from the border wars, who had talked about returning to his family's farm in this region. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "I knew someone in prison, another soldier who refused to follow orders. He said his family's farm was somewhere in this area, about 20 miles southeast of here. If we can find it, if he is there, he might help us." "That is a lot of ifs." "It is all we have," Jameson said. They traveled through the night, moving slowly and carefully through the forest. Jameson carried Roksha when she could not walk, and she walked when he needed to rest. It was brutal, exhausting work, made worse by the constant fear that every sound was a patrol, every shadow a pursuer. But they kept going, driven by desperation and the simple fact that stopping meant capture. Dawn found them at the edge of a large farm with fields of new planted crops stretching in all directions. A sturdy farmhouse sat at the center, smoke rising from its chimney. It looked peaceful, prosperous, and completely unreachable. There was no way to approach without crossing open ground where anyone could see them. "Is this the place?" Roksha asked. "I think so." The man in prison, his name was Thomas Kramer. He said his family raised sheep and wheat. "This looks right. And what do we do? Just walk up to the front door and hope he answers instead of his family turning us in for the reward?" "Yes," Jameson said, because he had no better plan. "That is exactly what we do." They waited until mid-morning when there was sure to be someone home. then walked out of the forest and across the fields toward the farmhouse. Jameson felt exposed every step of the way, convinced that at any moment someone would see them and sound an alarm. But they made it to the front door without incident, and Jameson knocked before he could lose his nerve. The woman who answered was in her 50s, with graying hair and suspicious eyes. "Can I help you?" "I am looking for Thomas Kramer," Jameson said. "I knew him during the war. Is he here?" The woman's expression shifted from suspicious to wary. "Thomas does not want to talk about the war. You should leave." "Please," Jameson said. "Just tell him Jameson Keller is here. Tell him I need help. He will understand." The woman studied them for a long moment, her gaze lingering on Roksha's covered head and the way she leaned heavily on Jameson. Then she sighed. "Wait here." She closed the door, and Jameson and Roksha stood on the porch, feeling terribly exposed. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors, and when his eyes met Jameson's, recognition flared immediately. "Jameson, by all the gods, what are you doing here?" "And who?" He stopped, his eyes widening as he took in Roksha despite her disguise. "Is that an orc?" "Her name is Roksha," Jameson said quietly. "I broke her out of a slave camp. We are being hunted. Thomas, I know I have no right to ask this, but we need help. Just a place to rest for a few days while she heals enough to travel. Then we will be gone and you will never see us again." Thomas stared at them, and Jameson could see him calculating the risks, weighing the danger against whatever sense of loyalty he might still feel toward a fellow deserter. Finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Get inside before someone sees you. My mother already thinks I am insane for letting you on the property. Try not to prove her right." The interior of the farmhouse was warm and clean, with the comfortable clutter of a working farm. Thomas's mother, who introduced herself as Alina, watched them with obvious disapproval, but did not protest, as Thomas led them to a room at the back of the house. "You can stay here," Thomas said. "But Jameson, you need to tell me everything. Why did you break an orc out of a slave camp? What are you running from? And what do you expect me to do about it?" So Jameson told him. He explained about the guilt that had driven him to the slave camp, about finding Roksha in the last cage, about everything that had happened since. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when Jameson finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You are either the bravest man I have ever met or the most foolish," Thomas said finally. "Probably both, and you understand that helping you could destroy my family. If the authorities find out we sheltered fugitives, we could lose the farm, end up in prison, or worse." "I know," Jameson said. "And if you want us to leave right now, we will. But Thomas, please, she is injured and exhausted, and we have been running for over a week. Just a few days. That is all I am asking." Thomas looked at Roksha, who had been silent through the entire exchange, her face still partially hidden by the scarf. "What do you say, Roksha? Is he worth all this trouble he has gotten you into?" Roksha pulled back her scarf, revealing her pointed ears and letting her disguise drop completely. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong despite her exhaustion. "He saved my life when he had no reason to. He has risked everything to keep me safe. And yes, he is worth every bit of trouble and then some. But if you cannot help us, just tell us now and we will go. I will not have his misplaced loyalty to you cost him any more than it already has." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then surprised them both by laughing. "You picked a fierce one, Jameson. All right, you can stay. 3 days to rest and heal, then you leave before dawn on the 4th day. Agreed, agreed, Jameson said, relief flooding through him. "Thank you, Thomas, truly." The next 3 days were the closest thing to peace either of them had experienced since the escape. Alina might not have approved of their presence, but she was too good-hearted to let anyone suffer under her roof. She prepared proper meals, gave Roksha herbs for her pain, and even provided clean clothes to replace their ragged, stained garments. Thomas proved to be as good a man as Jameson remembered. He shared news of the search efforts. The patrols had focused their attention north and west, away from his farm, which gave them a small window of safety. He also provided them with better supplies for their journey, a map showing routes through the wilderness, a good knife for Roksha, and enough food to last them to the border. But more than that, he and Alina gave them something precious, a glimpse of what a normal life could look like. Jameson helped with farm chores, working alongside Thomas to mend fences and feed animals. Roksha spent time with Alina in the kitchen, teaching her about orc healing herbs in exchange for learning human cooking techniques. In the evenings, they all sat around the fire, sharing stories and occasionally laughing, and it felt almost like being part of a family. On the second night, after Thomas and Alina had gone to bed, Jameson and Roksha sat together on the porch, looking out at the fields under starlight. "I could live like this," Roksha said quietly. "A simple life on a farm, growing things instead of running from things. Is that foolish?" "No," Jameson said. "It is not foolish at all. It is what I want too. Even with me, an orc woman who will never be fully accepted in human society. Our children would be half-breeds, outcasts in both worlds. Every day would be a struggle against prejudice and hatred. Is that really what you want?" Jameson took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I want you. Everything else we can figure out as we go. And for what it is worth, I think you would make an incredible mother. Our children would be lucky to have your strength and courage." Roksha turned to look at him, tears shining in her amber eyes. "You are talking about children, about a future. Jameson, we are still fugitives. We might not even make it to the border." "Then we make it to the border," he said with absolute conviction. "And then we find a place where we can build that simple life you talked about. A farm of our own, maybe. A place where you can practice your healing and I can grow things. A place where we are just Jameson and Roksha, not a human and an orc, not fugitives, just two people who love each other." "Love," Roksha whispered. "Is that what this is?" "Yes," Jameson said simply. "I love you, Roksha. I know it is fast. I know the circumstances are terrible, but it is true. I love your strength, your intelligence, your refusal to give up no matter what. I love the way you tease me and challenge me. I love waking up beside you and falling asleep holding you. I love you, and I want a future with you if you will have me." Roksha was crying openly now, but she was smiling too. "I love you too. I think I started loving you the moment you opened my cage, when you could have saved yourself and instead chose to save me. I prayed for someone to come, Jameson, but I never dared pray for someone like you." They kissed on the porch under the stars, and it felt like a promise. A promise of the future they would build together once they made it to safety. On the morning of the fourth day, they prepared to leave. Thomas gave them final instructions on the safest route to the border, a path through the mountains that was difficult but rarely patrolled. Alina packed them enough food for a week and made Roksha promise to take care of her leg. "You are good people," Thomas said as they prepared to depart. "What you are doing, crossing the boundaries that society has set up between humans and orcs, it matters. Maybe someday the rest of the world will catch up to where you already are." "Maybe," Jameson said. "But until then, we will just focus on surviving and building our own small piece of that better world." They left the farm at dawn, disappearing into the forest before any neighbors could see them. The journey to the border was as difficult as Thomas had warned. The mountain paths were steep and treacherous, and Roksha's leg, though much improved, still gave her trouble on the worst climbs. But they took it slowly, resting when they needed to, and kept moving forward. On the sixth day, they saw the border markers, tall stones carved with symbols denoting the edge of human territory and the beginning of the free lands. Beyond those stones, orc clans and human settlements existed in relative peace, and the slave trade was forbidden. It was not paradise, but it was safety. They crossed the border together at sunset, and when they passed the final marker, Roksha stopped and looked back at the territory they had escaped. "I never thought I would make it," she said quietly. "When I was in that cage, I had almost given up. And then you came and you gave me hope. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Jameson corrected, putting his arm around her shoulders. "And now we get to decide what comes next." What came next was a small settlement called Haven's Rest, about 3 days beyond the border. It was a mixed community: humans, orcs, and even a few elves, all living together in fragile peace. They found work easily enough, Jameson hiring on with a farming family and Roksha offering her services as a healer. They lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, and slowly, carefully, they began to build the life they had talked about. 6 months after their arrival, Jameson asked Roksha to marry him. It was not a formal proposal. They were working together in the small garden they had planted, covered in dirt and sweat, when he simply said, "I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife, officially and forever." "What do you say?" Roksha looked at him, and her smile was brighter than the sun. "I say yes. I have always said yes to you, from the moment you opened my cage." They married in a small ceremony attended by the friends they had made in Haven's Rest. It was nothing fancy, a simple exchange of vows under an old oak tree, officiated by the settlement's elder. But when Jameson slipped a ring he had carved from wood onto Roksha's finger, and when she kissed him as his wife for the first time, it felt more real and meaningful than any grand ceremony could have been. The first year of their marriage was not easy. They struggled with money, with prejudice from those who still could not accept their inter-species relationship, with Roksha's nightmares from her time in captivity, and Jameson's guilt from the war. But they faced every challenge together, and slowly, the wounds began to heal. Roksha established herself as the settlement's best healer, her knowledge of both orc and human medicine making her invaluable. Jameson discovered he had a talent for woodworking, and began crafting furniture and tools that sold well in the local market. They saved their money, planning for the future. 2 years after crossing the border, they bought a small farm on the outskirts of Haven's Rest. It was not much: 15 acres of land, a small house that needed repairs, and a barn that was half collapsed. But it was theirs, and they poured their hearts into making it home. They grew vegetables and herbs, kept chickens and goats, and slowly transformed the neglected property into a thriving homestead. Roksha planted a healing garden filled with medicinal plants, and Jameson built her a workshop where she could prepare her remedies. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch they had repaired together, watching the sunset and talking about their dreams. "I want children," Roksha said one evening, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I know it will be complicated. I know they will face challenges because of what they are, but I want to fill this house with life and laughter. What do you think?" Jameson pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I think you are going to be the most amazing mother, and I think our children will be incredibly lucky to have you. When do we start?" Roksha laughed, the sound filled with joy. "I think we already have. I am fairly certain I am pregnant." The news filled Jameson with a happiness so profound he could barely contain it. They spent the next months preparing. Jameson built a cradle and baby furniture while Roksha gathered supplies, and taught him everything he needed to know about caring for a newborn. The settlement rallied around them, with neighbors bringing gifts and offering advice, and for the first time, Jameson felt like they were truly part of a community. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, arriving with a cry that seemed to fill the whole world. She had Jameson's brown eyes and Roksha's green skin, small tusks just barely visible, and pointed ears that twitched when she was startled. They named her Sira, and from the moment Jameson held her, he knew that everything, all the fear, all the danger, all the struggle had been worth it to reach this moment. Watching Roksha with their daughter, seeing the gentle way she cradled Sira and the fierce love in her eyes, Jameson was transported back to that night in the slave camp, to the moment when he had crawled to the last cage and heard her say she had prayed for him. She had prayed for rescue, for hope, for a chance at freedom. And somehow, against all odds, that prayer had been answered. But it had not just been her prayer that was answered, Jameson realized. He had been praying too, in his own way, praying for redemption, for a purpose, for a reason to believe he could be better than his past mistakes. And Roksha had given him all of that and more. She had given him love, a family, and a future he had never dared to imagine. Their farm became known throughout the region as a place of healing and hospitality. Roksha treated anyone who came to her, regardless of species or ability to pay. Jameson used his carpentry skills to help neighbors with repairs and projects. They raised Sira with love and taught her to be proud of both sides of her heritage, to stand strong against prejudice, and to lead with compassion. As years passed, other children joined Sira, a son named Marcus with his father's build and his mother's amber eyes, and another daughter named Lyra, who had her mother's healing gift. The little farm that had once been neglected became a thriving homestead filled with life and love, exactly as Roksha had dreamed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch they had rebuilt a decade ago, watching their children play in the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and everything was peaceful. "Do you ever think about that night?" Roksha asked quietly, her hand finding his. "The night you crawled into the slave camp, all the time," Jameson admitted. "It was the night my real life began. Everything before that feels like someone else's story." "I still cannot believe you came," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "One man alone with no plan and no weapons, trying to save people he did not even know. It was the bravest, most foolish thing anyone has ever done for me." "You prayed for me," Jameson said simply. "How could I not come?" Roksha laughed, the sound as beautiful now as it had been the first time he heard it. "I prayed for someone. I never imagined I would get you a man who would not just free me but would love me, build a life with me, give me a family and a home. You gave me everything I had lost and things I never knew I could have." "We gave each other everything," Jameson said, echoing the words he had spoken when they first crossed the border. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every dangerous moment, every close call, every hardship. All of it was worth it to end up here, with you, with our children, with this life we have built." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Sira called out that dinner was ready, her voice carrying across the garden, and Marcus and Lyra came running in from wherever they had been exploring. The family gathered around the table Jameson had built, sharing food Roksha had prepared, and their home filled with laughter and stories. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Jameson and Roksha lay in their bed, wrapped in each other's arms. This was their ritual, had been since those first terrifying nights on the run, falling asleep holding each other, finding comfort and safety in the other's presence. "I love you," Roksha whispered in the darkness. "I will never stop being grateful that you came for me, that you chose me, that you gave me this beautiful life. "I love you too," Jameson whispered back. "And I will never stop being grateful that you prayed, that you survived, that you let me love you despite every reason you had not to trust a human. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Roksha. You and our children and this life we have made. This is what I was meant for. Not war, not violence, but this building something good with someone I love." They drifted off to sleep together, safe and warm and surrounded by the life they had fought so hard to create. And if sometimes Jameson still dreamed of that night in the slave camp, of crawling through darkness toward an uncertain fate, those dreams no longer carried the weight of guilt and fear. Instead, they were reminders of how far they had come, of the journey that had led him to the woman in the last cage who had prayed for him and given him a reason to be brave. The farm thrived, the children grew strong and happy, and Jameson and Roksha faced every challenge that came their way with the same determination that had carried them through those desperate days as fugitives. They became pillars of their community, proof that love could bridge even the widest divides, that compassion and courage could overcome prejudice and hatred. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled, they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset together. Two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built a light bright enough to guide them home. The slave camp and the desperate flight were behind them, fading into memory. What remained was the life they had chosen, the family they had created, and the love that had started with a prayer in the darkness and grew into something strong enough to withstand anything the world could throw at them. It was not always easy, being an interspecies couple in a world that still harbored deep prejudices. There were those who refused to accept their marriage, who looked at their children with disgust or pity. But Jameson and Roksha had learned long ago that the opinions of small-minded people mattered far less than the love they shared and the family they protected. They taught their children to stand proud, to never be ashamed of who they were, and to meet hatred with dignity and strength. As their children grew older and eventually started families of their own, Jameson and Roksha became grandparents, their farm expanding to accommodate a growing family. Sira married a kind orc man from a neighboring settlement and gave them grandchildren who loved hearing stories about their grandparents' escape and the farm they had built from nothing. Marcus became a carpenter like his father, crafting beautiful furniture that was sought after throughout the region. Lyra followed her mother's path, becoming a renowned healer who traveled to settlements far and wide, teaching others her blend of orc and human medicine. The farm that Jameson and Roksha had bought as a neglected plot of land became a family legacy, a place where multiple generations gathered for celebrations and holidays, where grandchildren ran through the same gardens their parents had played in, where love and acceptance were the only rules that mattered. On their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Jameson looked at Roksha, her hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with years of laughter and hard work, her green skin just as beautiful to him as it had been the first night he saw her, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. They had done it. They had survived, built a life, raised a family, and created a legacy that would outlive them both. "What are you thinking about?" Roksha asked, catching him staring. "That night in the slave camp," he said honestly. "How terrified I was, crawling through the darkness with no idea what I was doing, or if I would even find anyone to save. And then I reached your cage, and you looked at me and said you had prayed for me, and somehow I knew everything was going to be all right. Not easy, but all right." "Were you right?" she asked with a smile. "I was right," he confirmed, pulling her close. "It has not been easy, but it has been all right. Better than all right, it has been extraordinary." As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, casting golden light across the farm they had built together. Jameson and Roksha stood hand in hand, surrounded by the family that was living proof that love conquered hatred, that courage defeated fear, and that sometimes prayers whispered in darkness were answered by ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. The story of the man who crawled into a slave camp alone at night and the orc woman in the last cage who prayed for him became legend in Haven's Rest and the surrounding settlements. Parents told it to their children as an example of bravery and love transcending boundaries. Young people drew inspiration from it when facing their own prejudices and challenges. And through it all, Jameson and Roksha simply lived their lives, proving every day that the legend was true, that love was worth fighting for, that family was worth protecting, and that home was not a place but the people you chose to share your life with. In the end, their story was simple yet profound. A soldier seeking redemption found purpose in a desperate rescue. A captive woman who prayed for salvation found love with the man who answered her prayer. Together, they built a life that became a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that love could change the world, one courageous choice at a time. And when, many years later, they were laid to rest side by side in the garden they had planted together all those decades ago, their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate lives well lived and a love that had never faltered. The farm continued to thrive, passed down through generations, a lasting testament to what two people could build when they chose love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over the prejudices of a broken world. Their story did not end with their deaths. It lived on in every interspecies marriage that happened in Haven's Rest, in every child who grew up believing they could be proud of their heritage, in every person who chose courage over complacency. It lived on in the healing practices Roksha had taught and the carpentry techniques Jameson had perfected. It lived on in the very soil of the farm, nourished by their love and labor, continuing to produce life and beauty long after they were gone. But most of all, it lived on in the hearts of those who knew them, who had seen firsthand what real love looked like. Not the easy love of fairy tales, but the hard-won love forged in desperation and despair, tested by prejudice and hardship, and emerging stronger for every challenge it faced. That was the legacy Jameson and Roksha left behind, proof that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made new every day, and that those who chose it with courage and conviction could change not just their own lives but the world around them. And somewhere, in that place between sleeping and waking where prayers are born and hope takes flight, perhaps Roksha's prayer still echoed, a prayer for someone brave enough or foolish enough to come. A prayer answered by Jameson Keller, who crawled into a slave camp alone at night and found not just someone to save but his entire future, his purpose, and the great love of his life waiting in the last cage, believing he would come even before she knew his name. That prayer, that moment of faith in the darkest hour, became the foundation of everything that followed. It was the spark that ignited a love strong enough to weather any storm, the beginning of a family legacy that would span generations, and the birth of a legend that would inspire countless others to choose courage, to believe in love, and to never underestimate the power of prayers whispered in darkness by those who refuse to lose hope.